Check. Good. Grab a seat, everybody. We're going to be starting soon. Hope you got some delicious bites and caffeine. Well, good evening and welcome everyone in person and our friends online to the second installment of our speaker series here at Bayview Glen. These events, they aim to delve deeper into topics related to faith by gathering insight from diverse perspectives and fields of inquiry, and in doing so, we hope to learn more about what we perhaps already think, to learn about what we don't think, and to learn about viewpoints held that are different than ours in order to stretch us, to grow us, and to help us love each other better, ultimately at the end of it all. Last fall, or last February, if you weren't here, we did a panel looking at the first two chapters of Genesis. What does it mean? What does it not mean? Next February, we'll be looking at different views of the doctrine of hell. But tonight, we're going to be looking at the topic of divine violence. You can't go too far in the Bible or the Torah without finding instances where God commands violence or people commit violence in God's name, whether it's the killing of the firstborns in Egypt or the Canaanite conquest or simply even the sacrificial system. These books are blood-soaked, and so it can raise questions for us regardless of your spiritual background. How do I understand this? Why would God do this? Is God a good God? And isn't this just like one people group committing violence and claiming their God said it was okay? How is this different? How do we understand this? And so to answer these questions, we have gathered the three wisest and most handsome men in the GTA, and they will bring their own fields of inquiry. We're pleased to welcome Dr. Logan Gates. He is a Christian apologist and an adjunct speaker with Apologetics Canada with an expertise in political theory and history of political thought. We also have Dr. Gord Oeste. He's an adjunct professor of biblical studies at Tyndale University College and Seminary, specializing in warfare in the Bible and the ancient Near East. And we're also happy to welcome Rabbi Jarrod Grover, the senior rabbi at Beth Tikvah, known for his commitment to Jewish tradition, Israel engagement, egalitarianism, and social justice. Each speaker is going to present for a brief period of time, followed by an intermission. Everyone's going to come back, and we're going to take some Q&A. So during the presentations, there's going to be a QR screen behind me, and also during our intermission, you're welcome to scan that and submit questions. And if you don't do it now, we'll have it up during the break as well. So before we begin, let's open together in a time of prayer, and then I will welcome up Dr. Gates. Heavenly Father, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, we thank you for the opportunity that we can gather like this and learn more how to love you with our minds. We just pray tonight for unity and peace. We thank you for our speakers and the gifts that you've given to them and how they're willing to share their wisdom as well with us. Would you bless them, give them clarity, strength, and peace? And we pray that our conduct tonight would glorify you. Amen. Let's begin with Dr. Gates.
Wonderful. Well, good evening, and thank you so much for coming. I'm excited for this conversation we'll be having this evening on this very important topic. And I want to begin my comments just by affirming the importance of this topic and the difficulty of the question. For us as modern readers of the Bible, we cannot help, as Pastor Sawyer mentioned, but stumble across these passages that are simply difficult to think through. We can think, for instance, of Noah's Ark, which when we tell that story to children, we do it in a cute way, talking about the animals here and there cutting on the boat. But we can forget and maybe rediscover as adults that this is a sobering story. We read in Genesis 6 that God determined to make an end to all flesh because the earth was filled with violence and all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. A whole earth destroyed. And that's not the only example. We can think of Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 18 and 19, when God rains down fire and sulfur on the cities because the outcry against them was great and their sin was very grave. We can think of that interesting character Uzzah, who reaches out in 2 Samuel 6 to stop the ark from falling. He wasn't supposed to do this. This was against God's explicit law, and God struck him down. We can think of the sons of Aaron, the priests, who offered unauthorized fire to God. That's how it's described. And in response, God sends fire down to consume them. We can think of the Canaanites in Deuteronomy 20, when God tells them, Israel, that they should devote them to complete destruction, that they may not teach you to do according to all their abominable practices that they've done for their gods, and so you sin against the Lord your God. For those of us who are Christians, there are New Testament examples as well. We can think of accounts of Ananias and Sapphira. We can think of Elymas, the magician, struck blind. We can think of how often Jesus spoke about punishment after death, about hell. No other figure in the Bible speaks more about hell than Jesus. And so I think this question is challenging for us. It, on the one hand, is a question of consistency. Can this be the same God who's both angry and loving? But also it's a question of, why would I want to believe in a God like that? The way I want to approach these topics tonight is in two parts. I want to first speak about this question as a political theorist. That is my academic background. And then I want to consider this question from the perspective of an apologist. And I'll come to what that means in a moment. So first, I want to begin looking at this as a political theorist. And actually, I think I have a slide up here that begins with this question. What is the standard by which we judge divine violence? I think that's the question I'm interested in as a theorist. And the second question is, how can God's anger fit with God's love? So I want to start with this question of the standard by which we judge divine violence. What do I mean by that? When we read these Old Testament texts, and when we make judgments about whether God was doing the right thing in those circumstances, we're appealing to some kind of a standard off of which we're making that judgment. So for instance, when we see God seeming to punish innocent people, and we say, that's unjust. Well, the reason why we might say that is because we feel, well, it's not right for innocent people to be punished. That's the standard. In a similar way, when we see God seeming to overreact from our perspective to certain instances, well, that's appealing to a standard of proportionality, that if there is injustice that's committed, well, there should perhaps be a response to that, but it should be proportionate. We could similarly think about if it seems in the Bible sometimes that God is favoring one people group more than another, we might say, well, that's not right, and that's because we're assuming a standard that you shouldn't be prejudiced. You should have an attitude of equality towards all peoples, right? As you maybe recall, justice is often displayed in art as a woman with a blindfold on. There shouldn't be prejudice there. But where I'm going with this is that there is always a standard we're appealing to, and every culture has one. A standard by which we say violence, perhaps in this case, is permissible, but in these other cases, not so much. And I want to suggest that not only does every culture have some way of adjudicating that, we also get that view from somewhere. In other words, the standards that we might take for granted as logical, of course you can't punish an innocent person, actually have a history. And this is what the discipline of the history of political thought looks at. It looks at where these ideas have come from. And when it comes to the Western intellectual tradition, if we want to see these early debates about when is war just, when is violence okay, it brings us back to the ancient Greeks, to figures like Thucydides or Plato and Aristotle. And I want to begin just to show you an example of early Western discussion about warfare using an example from Plato, and particularly his book, Plato's Republic. Now, if you know this book, this is a book about justice. That's the theme of this dialogue. Socrates is the main character, and in this book, he's trying to answer the question, what is justice? And he goes about answering this question by designing a city, imagining it in the course of a conversation. And in this city, he says, we'll see what justice is. And so the city is being built, and lo and behold, a part of this city is that there is some warfare involved. In other words, there's a kind of warfare for Plato which is not only compatible with justice, but actually a part of what justice requires. But when we look at the city in the detail, we see that what Plato says about when war is okay is quite different from what we would say. And there's a quote here on the slide for us to look at. Plato says, here's an instance where justice is permissible for the city. It's permissible when when justice is permissible, when war is permissible. It's permissible when it's Greeks fighting non-Greeks. So here's what he says. Therefore, as Greeks, they won't ravage Greece or burn houses, nor will they agree that in any city all are their enemies, men, women, and children, but that there are always a few enemies who are to blame for their differences. On all these grounds, they won't be willing to ravage lands or tear down houses. So what's going on here is Plato is saying warfare is permissible, but when it's warfare between Greeks, there are all these rules that we need to apply. You can't destroy whole cities. You have to identify the few people who are bad. But what's implied here is that if you're fighting barbarians, people who don't speak Greek, that's what the ancient Greeks thought barbarians were, none of these rules apply. Greeks saw themselves as inherently more virtuous, and so therefore, in this city that's supposed to show us justice, the kind of warfare that's allowed is warfare against non-Greeks. That's totally okay. And that feels different from us. And when we look at the rest of the Western tradition, we see that a change happens after Plato. When we go from Plato and Aristotle, who have this bias towards Greeks, and when we pass from then to Augustine, to Ambrose, to Aquinas, we see that a change has happened. And that is because equality has entered onto the scene. This is the contribution of Judeo-Christian values to political thought, is that we came to this idea that all humans are made in God's image, and that has an implication on how we think through even something like warfare. So I'm going to read a quote to you here from Aquinas, the theologian in the Middle Ages who's building on earlier thinkers like Augustine, and here's what he says about warfare. And I think this should start to sound more like what many of us believe. He says, if a war is to be just, three things are needed. It must be waged by due authorities, for those who may lawfully use the sword to defend a commonwealth against criminals disturbing it from within may also use the sword of war to protect it from enemies from without. But the cause must be just. Those whom we attack must have done some wrong, which deserves attack, and those waging war must intend to promote good and avoid evil. So here for Aquinas we see a just war isn't as simple as, are they of your ethnicity or not? No. People are treated as equal here. It's a matter of justice. Is the cause to war just? In other words, is it in response to a wrong that's been suffered? Is it perhaps a case of self-defense in face of an ongoing attack? But then there's even more about the heart that needs to go into someone who's fighting a war. They need to be seeking to promote good. And we'll go to the next slide here. What this leads to in the history of political thought, even still today, if you read a political theory textbook on just war theory, maybe by someone named Michael Walzer, who wrote a text in the 1970s, which is the main work in this field, he divides up when war is just into two questions. You have first the question of jus ad bellum, in other words, the question of when is it right to go to war, and this requires things like war must be a last resort, it must be wielded by an appropriate authority, there must be a reasonable prospect of success, and it must be done in response to a wrong or ongoing wrong like self-defense. The next category is jus in bello, what is permissible to do in war. So this refers to ideas like you must discriminate between combatants and non-combatants, violence must be proportionate to the offenses committed, and some practices like torture are never permissible. Where am I going with this? I want to suggest that when we ask these questions about God, about whether he's just in certain cases, without even thinking, we start appealing to these ideas. These ideas that, whether we realize it or not, actually come from the Judeo-Christian tradition. Because if you get out your Augustine or your Ambrose and your Aquinas, you will find that they came up with these ideas from the Bible. From looking at passages like Deuteronomy 20, where we get one of the earliest codes of permissible warfare in all of antiquity, where we're seeing that Israel was to give warning to the cities that they were going to attack, presumably to let women and children leave. This focus on non-combatants being not the appropriate targets of war. We could think about other passages of the Bible where God seems, if we even think of the Canaanites, that violence is not just permitted on a whim. It is only allowed in response to certain grave injustices. And what I want to suggest is, and I'll go to the next slide here, is that what can happen, which we should think about, is I'll just read this quote here. We should take pause when we find ourselves judging God's actions in the Bible according to standards which were derived from God's actions in the Bible. In other words, when you think about Aquinas and people who came up with these ideas we now take for granted, they not only didn't see inconsistency with their views on the God of the Bible, they actually saw the morality of the God of the Bible as the source of their views. And so if we go to God concerned about innocence, if we go to God concerned about proportionality, I think we need to realize that, hang on a minute, these very values that I have, these standards I have, historically speaking, actually emerge from the Christian tradition. That doesn't resolve the question completely, but it should give us pause to say immediately, oh, there's some great contradiction here. It might just be that we're missing something, that we maybe need to read these passages more closely, or perhaps there are parts of the morality of the God of the Bible that we just, as a culture today, don't value as much. All right, that's my thought as a political theorist on this question. What are the standards we're using? These standards tend to come from the Christian tradition. But now I want to move on to this next question, and we can go to the next slide. And this is a question I want to address as a Christian and as an apologist. Now, this word apologetics, many of you may be familiar with this idea. It comes from the Bible. It's found in verses like 1 Peter 3:15, where Peter says, all Christians should be prepared to give a defense when people ask them for a reason for the hope that is in them. So that word defense is the word apologia in the Greek. It means a reasoned response. And what I like about that verse is it tells us two things. It tells us, one, that faith shouldn't just be about what religion you've grown up in. You should only believe a certain religion if you believe it's really true, if it's based in reason. But the second thing I like about this verse is that it gets us comfortable with questions, because the idea is, if Christianity is true, and that's the only reason you should believe it, well then you shouldn't be afraid to ask hard questions about it. Because if it is ultimately true, when you follow truth, it should lead you to Christ. And so I say all that by way of saying I think that these questions are worth wrestling with and that we shouldn't be afraid of them, those of us who are Christians. And my sense of what perhaps the key question is, at least for me, as I think about this and my own faith, is when I look at the violence of the God of the Bible, I get this sense of anger from God. And how can that anger fit with the picture of God that's loving? So I just want to end my time reflecting on this last question. We can go to the next slide here. Yes, that's great. The first way I want to approach this is by maybe asking, in our Western 21st century eyes, have we perhaps made the wrong assumption when we say that love and anger are opposites? Let's imagine you have a child who comes home from school to your home on the school bus. And they get off the bus and they walk up to you and you say, how was your day at school? And your child says, well, I got beat up on the school bus. Now, if your response as a parent is just to sort of shrug your shoulders and say, life's tough, bucko. You need to get used to that. I might question your love for your child. Because from the love you have from your child, there should be a sense of justice. It will matter to you when your child's mistreated. And with that sense of justice, there comes the possibility of an appropriate, measured response of anger. Not out of proportion, not blown up completely, but actually, the presence of anger is a sign of a notion of justice, which I think has to fit with some idea of love. In other words, I think the opposite of love isn't anger. I think it's actually indifference. And so when we see these two elements of God in the Bible, I think we should not be quick to say, well, this is just impossible. I think actually love requires a sense of justice, and that can come with anger. And this actually, we'll go to the next slide here, is how God presents himself as a God of both love and justice. On Mount Sinai, when Moses asks to see God's glory, to see what makes God God, to see God in all his majesty, God shows Moses his back while Moses is in the cleft of a rock, but then also says these words, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty. God says, if you want to see my glory, it's found in my love, and it's found in my justice. And if we look at how the proportion of that passage looks, it's much more love is God's identity. And this is something confirmed in the New Testament. God is love. That is God's essential quality. But with being a God of love, there must come some notion of justice. And that's what we see in this moment on Mount Sinai. Now, at the same time, I think we might say, okay, well, sure, love and justice, those matter, but does it have to be so violent? We can have justice, but do we need to have justice with violence? I think that's, again, a valid question, but again, I think there's maybe some things we've lost sight of as a culture, and we can go to the next slide here. I wonder if one thing we've lost sight of is the sacredness of one another. A friend of mine was teaching a Sunday school class, and for an activity, he passed out Play-Doh to people. Everyone got a little piece of Play-Doh, and he told them to make a little Play-Doh creature. And so they spent a couple minutes doing that, and then he said, I want you now to introduce, each of you, your Play-Doh creature to the room. So they went around in a circle. He said, give it a little name, some backstory. And so they go around, with these cute names, Mr. Muffin, like Play-Doh creature, something like that. And he go around the room and do that, and then he says, okay, now that we've done that, I'd like you to hand your Play-Doh creature to the person on your left. So they hand the Play-Doh creature to the person on their left, and he says, okay, now that you have, the person, your neighbor's Play-Doh creature, I want you to hold it in one hand, and I want you to take your other hand and go like this. And smush it. And they did this, and he recounts the looks of horror on people's faces as they saw their neighbor squishing Mr. Muffin. And what his point was this, that in a weird way, we can even grow attached to this little creature we made 2 minutes ago and gave a small name and backstory to. How much more if there is a God who has made us in his image, who has knit us together in our mother's womb, and who, from the Christian perspective, has come down into the world and laid down his life for us on the cross? How much more would it matter to that God that we mar one another who are made in God's image? And this is what we do when we hold bitterness against one another, when we gossip about each other, when we refuse to forgive as we've been forgiven. We mar the image of God that he has placed in one another, and we all do this. Perhaps we've lost sight of that sacredness that makes so serious the ways we mistreat one another. The second thing I suspect we maybe have overlooked is the seriousness of sin in general. I think sometimes, I know we're having a dialogue on hell coming up, but I think one thing that's often said about that is, how can a finite number of sins lead to an infinite kind of punishment? It just seems disproportionate. But again, if I can give another illustration, I think that maybe we're missing something about what makes sin so serious. There is a Mr. Bean episode, one of the older ones, where Mr. Bean meets the Queen. I wonder if you've seen this one. And the Queen is shaking a bunch of people's hands in a line, and Mr. Bean is one of them. And he quickly realizes that his shirt is off, and he almost has his pants not pulled up all the way. It's an embarrassing scene, classic Mr. Bean, but at the last minute, he gets everything right. He's presentable for the Queen. The Queen's making her way down the line, and what he does is he bows very deeply, and he actually headbutts the Queen, and she tumbles over backwards. Now, if this just were any old person he had headbutted, it would be humorous, but it wouldn't be mortifying. But it's mortifying because the Queen represents some kind of majesty or glory that makes it that much more of a bigger deal. And I think in the same way, when we think about God, how much more beyond the Queen is this someone who embodies a kind of glory and a holiness and a majesty that makes our sins against him that much more serious. In other words, it's not just the action itself, it's the majesty of the one the action is done against. R.C. Sproul, who's a theologian, puts it this way. He's commenting on these tricky passages where people are put to death in the Bible. Here's what he says about that. Is the death penalty for sin unjust? By no means. Remember that God voluntarily created us. He gave us the highest privilege of being his image bearers. He made us but a little lower than the angels. He freely gave us dominion over all the earth. We have not used the gift of life for the purpose God intended. Life on this planet has become the arena in which we daily carry out the work of cosmic treason. Sin is treason against a perfectly pure sovereign. It is an act of supreme ingratitude toward the one to whom we owe everything, to the one who has given us life itself. Hans Kung says the most mysterious aspect of the mystery of sin is not that the sinner deserves to die, but rather that the sinner in the average situation continues to exist. Kung asks the right question. When Adam and Eve sin in Genesis 2, we're told that God said to them, "In the day you eat of this tree, you shall surely die." In Ezekiel 18:4, where we read that the soul who sins shall die. In the New Testament, we read in Romans 6:23 that the wages of sin is death. In other words, when we look at these accounts of shocking justice in the Bible, I think what we have to realize is that this actually is what all of us ultimately deserve, and is a warning to us that this is what we will all ultimately face unless we come to God through repentance and faith. And I think this is a shocking thing to claim, but I think from the Christian perspective, it is something reinforced by this story of the cross. And we'll go to the next slide here. I wonder if you've thought about the story of the cross in terms of the seriousness of sin. A friend of mine, his father is diabetic, and he had to take his father to the emergency room because his father wasn't doing well. They weren't sure what was really going on. And when they got there, the emergency room doctor said, "This is more serious than you think. We're going to need to do an amputation right now." And my friend, on hearing this news, he told me afterwards that it led him to sort of huddle around his father, his mother, his siblings, and they all sort of were scratching their heads on what to do with this prescription of what was required. It's quite extreme. And they wondered maybe whether the doctor was just doing the expedient thing, the easy thing, instead of going through the treatment that maybe take longer and be harder, but you get to keep a limb. And after this happened, he was reflecting back on the incident, and he said, what really would have changed my mind about the doctor is if something like this had happened. If the doctor had seen us meeting and all concerned and said, look, I know this sounds really serious, more serious than you think it is. But here's the thing, I really think your father needs this operation to survive. And we actually don't even have enough blood matching your father's blood type, and I'm a match. I think this needs to happen. I'm going to give some blood so that the surgery can go forward. Now, if you set aside the medical ethics issues involved in that scenario, he said, my friend said, if something like that happened, I could know that this diagnosis, as serious as it seemed, was one that I could trust, because I could see what the doctor was willing to do about it at a cost to himself. And I think in the same way, when we think about what the cross is saying to us, it is God saying, this situation is this serious. And don't just take my word for it. I will show you by myself, taking cost onto myself in order to prevent, by what any means I can, apart from going over your own will, to give you the chance to be reconciled to me. I think the key question, and we can go to the next slide, that I see, the real puzzle here, is not just about, is sin that serious, but is it possible for God to fully have these two attributes? Can he truly be fully just and fully loving? That's what I think is the deeper puzzle that's going on here. I think we take for granted that these two things hold together. We were just saying that love involves some notion of justice. But if I can give you another example, imagine that you have a judge who knows the accused, and this accused owes an enormous amount of money that they couldn't go back. They'd have to go to jail for if the law is enforced. And the case is made against the accused, and the judge has a few options. The judge might just say, well, justice demands that this person receive this punishment, and that's that. In which case, we would say the judge is just, but we probably wouldn't say the judge is loving. I mean, that's just not the word that would come to mind. But another option is the judge says, I know this guy. I'm going to let him off. We would say, maybe that's loving of a sort, but it's a travesty of justice. In other words, love and justice, if we take them to their perfection, ultimately are in tension with one another. If you have love, it's got to be at the expense of justice. Or if you have justice, well, if it's pure justice, then that's not really loving. And I think that any religion that claims that God is loving and just has to face this problem. But I think what compels me about the Christian faith is there is clarity that's brought to this question. Because if you take the scenario, what happens in Jesus is you have the judge passing the verdict. It must be paid. but then stepping down from the bench and writing a personal check for the full amount. God is just. Justice has been done, but it's deeply loving because it's God himself who's taking on the cost. Jesus, throughout his life, one thing that set him apart, Tim Keller has pointed this out, is he called God Abba Father. And no one really called God Abba Father in this time period. It was an odd way to have a person refer to God that way. Jesus did it his whole life, except when he was on the cross. And the words he used on the cross were, my God, this more distant language. And I think Keller is right to point out that this is a reflection of something the Bible talks about elsewhere. This idea that on the cross, Jesus is taking on the separation from God, the distance from God that we deserved, in order that we might be able, as Paul says, to call out to God, Abba, Father, having come to him through repentance and faith, being forgiven, knowing where we stand with God. In other words, the Christian idea is that we don't have love at the expense of justice, but love through justice. The Bible puts it this way in Romans. We can go to the next slide here. Romans 3. It was to show his righteousness at the present time, so that he might be just and justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. In other words, if you look for the greatest act of divine violence in the Bible, it's not to do with the Canaanites. It's the cross. And yet, when Moses looked up at God and saw that God was just and loving, this is the same thing the Christian should see at the cross. That God's character is the same in both cases. He's fully just, but he's fully loving. I'll have this quote here from D.A. Carson. He puts it this way. Do you want to see the greatest evidence of the love of God? Go to the cross. Do you want to see the greatest evidence of the justice of God? Go to the cross. It's where wrath and mercy meet. The climax of redemptive history is the cross. And I'll just close with this final verse. I know as we think about the God of the Old Testament and New Testament, sometimes we can feel they're quite different. But actually, this next slide reminds us that in terms of what this God asks of us, it is certainly one and the same. Cast away from you all the transgressions you've committed, and make yourselves a new heart and a new spirit. Why will you die, O house of Israel? For I have no pleasure in the death of anyone, declares the Lord God. So turn and live. All right, thank you very much.
Well, Logan's done such a great job of kind of painting the tensions for us. And particularly for me, one of my areas, Old Testament studies, and that tension between the God that we find in the Old Testament, it seems to at times command violence and even genocide. How do you reconcile that with Jesus, who says, turn the other cheek? And so in wrestling through that myself, I want to share a little bit of some of the things that have helped me in wrestling through that question, some of the things that are useful for me in kind of putting some of those pieces together. And crucial for me in putting some of those pieces together is just recognizing the importance of context. In situating this God in the Old Testament within the context in which the Bible was written, and just comparing and contrasting, seeing who is this God? How does he work? What does he look like? So I want to begin by looking at the ancient Near Eastern context. And if we can go to that, if we can go to the slide, recognizing that God for different peoples in the ancient Near East, both the Egyptians, the Mesopotamians, for them, you never went to war without God or the gods saying, yep, you're good. You've got the green light. And so the quote there from Samun Kang kind of emphasizes that point, that nobody goes to war in the ancient Near East unless your God says so. So, for example, Shalmaneser talks about going to war, and he says, by the command of Ashur, his God, he goes to war. Similarly, we find that with other peoples in the ancient Near East, where they go to war with divine approval. God participates in the battles, and God authorizes the battles. So if we can go to the next slide. the kings not only would go to war with divine approval and with the divine stamp of, yes, you're cleared to go, but when they describe their battles, this is, again, part of that trying to situate what we see in the Bible within the larger context of people around the Israelites and how they talked about their wars and about their battles. So when kings in the ancient Near East fought battles, they would describe them using hyperbole. Hyperbole is kind of overstatement in order to make an emotive point. So, for example, when we live kind of in this sort of area, and my wife's family lives up near Ottawa, and so when our family drove up there when our kids were little, Grandma and Grandpa might ask our kids, how was the trip? And our kids would say, oh, it took forever. And Grandma and Grandpa knew, okay, well, they didn't mean forever as in eternity. They just mean it felt like a long time. Our kids used hyperbole to express, in that case, how they felt, that it felt like a long time. Kings in the ancient Near East did a very similar type of thing. When they were describing their battle victories, they would use hyperbole. So on the next slide, you'll see that, for example, an Assyrian king, Tiglath-Pileser, talks about going to war. He describes all of his battles, and he fights these Alamu Arameans. And he decisively defeats them. Like, this is a significant victory, and he does it 28 times. In fact, twice. It's same time in 1 year. At times, he talks about covering incredible amounts of territory. He'll say that he traveled up to Carchemish, a distance of 450 kilometers. Now, today, if we got in our car and I drove up to, Ottawa's ballpark-ish, depending on which part of Toronto you're leaving from. Ottawa's about 450 kilometers. We can do that no problem in, well, it depends on how fast you're driving. But let's say within a good amount of time. Back then, the average person could walk about 20 kilometers in a day. If you were on horseback, you could go about 30, maybe 40 kilometers in a day. So when the king says that they traveled all the way to Carchemish, 450 kilometers, he's not exactly describing how long the trip took in literal terms. Let's keep going. Next slide. So, for example, King Mesha would have been a contemporary of the Old Testament prophets Elijah and Elisha. He talks about how he goes into battle against the Israelites. And in this battle against the Israelites, he says that they were wiped out, that Israel is gone to ruin forever. Now, we know that Israel continues long after this. So when Mesha talks about his battle victories, he uses hyperbole to describe a decisive victory. Next example, an Egyptian pharaoh talks about going to war against a variety of different people. He recounts all of the people that he trounced in his battle victories. And Merneptah's writing 1207 BC, before the Common Era, so somewhere this would ballpark be in the Joshua Judges kind of time frame. And he talks about all of these battle victories, and he talks about fighting against Israel, and he says that he fought against Israel, and when he battled against them, he said, Israel is wasted, its seed is not. Kind of a poetic way of saying, I destroyed all of the people who could reproduce. There are no more people who could have more kids. Completely destroyed, he says. Well, again, we know from history that Israel does continue. King Merneptah's using hyperbole in order to describe his battle victories. So if we go to the next slide, in conclude, we see that kings in the ancient Near East, in the context in which Israel lived and wrote the books of Scripture, we see that kings went to war with the support of their gods. They the gods fought with their peoples, and when kings talked about this, when they described their battle victories, they used hyperbole at times to describe them. Let's take a look at some Old Testament passages. And these are the passages that are really difficult because here's where we see divine violence right up close and personal. So the book of Deuteronomy, in a passage, Logan quoted for us Deuteronomy 20. This is another one of those passages in the Old Testament that talk about divine violence. God instructs the Israelites to go to war with the Canaanites, and he says to them, when you fight them and after you have defeated them, you must destroy them totally. Make no treaty with them, show no mercy. And if you're like me, you go, what? That doesn't sound like the God that I know and love. And yet, if we continue on from the book of Deuteronomy to the book of Joshua, we read that in the Battle of Jericho, for example, Joshua kills everybody, every living thing in the city, men and women, young and old, cattle, sheep, and donkeys, everybody. Flip forward just a couple of chapters, just hit this point even a little bit further. In this quote is taken from a summary of Israel's battles in the southern part of the land of Canaan, and there we're told that Israel, in a variety of different places, left no survivors. Joshua does this. He left no survivors, totally destroyed all who breathed, just as the Lord, the God of Israel, had commanded. Whew. You think about that. Think about what that's saying. Even at the end of by the time we get to the end of, it's almost at the end of the book of Joshua in Joshua 21, as the book of Joshua describes Israel's battles, here are the results of their battles, that the Lord gave Israel all the land, that none of their enemies withstood them. Every one of God's promises was fulfilled. They took all of the land. So at one level, this is the kind of the version of the book of Joshua that kind of I learned when I was in Sunday school, was this, that Joshua conquered all of the land of Canaan. There were no survivors. None of their enemies withstood them. And again, we go, whoa, what? This is God that we're talking about. Who authorizes this? Israel goes to war with God, and God says, here's what I want you to do. Well, let's look a little bit more closely. And these are, I want to drop into place just a couple of things that they're not easy to grapple with, but I think they're important to recognize. So if we go to one example, and this is in that section where just before the one battle summary that I talked about, in one of the battles, in Joshua 10, we read that when it comes to the city of Debir, that Joshua and the Israelites fought. They put everybody to the sword. Everyone was totally destroyed. There were no survivors. But, flip forward, 5 chapters later, the Israelites are going to war again against the city of Debir, also called Kiryat Sefer. And Caleb leads the Israelite attack against that same city, and he offers his daughter, hey, if you can conquer the city of Debir, you can marry my beautiful daughter, Aksa. What, huh? We should be going, wait, what, huh? How's that possible? They killed everybody, left no one alive, no survivors, and yet 5 chapters later, there they are, there's more people. My suggestion to you is that the book of Joshua, just like kings in the ancient Near East, used hyperbole to describe battle victories. Wait a minute, Gord, you say, that's just one off. That's just one example. How can you go about saying there's hyperbole being used in the book of Joshua? Well, this isn't just the only example. There are, if you go to the next slide, you'll see that there are numerous examples where, there are a good number of examples where, on the one hand, we read that Joshua and the Israelites completely destroyed the city, left no survivors, and yet you keep reading in either the book of Joshua or maybe if you get to the book of Judges, there's survivors. Or in other places, we read about how Joshua and the Israelites defeated kings, completely destroyed them, and yet a few chapters later, there are kings in those same places, there are people in those same places, there are armies in those same places that were completely defeated. So what do we do with that? Well, my suggestion, again, to you is that Joshua used hyperbole, overstatement, for the sake of emphasizing decisive battle victories. That when the Bible says we killed everyone, left no one alive, that the Old Testament writers are using hyperbole and that they don't mean there's bodies on the ice, or there's bodies left all over the place, that every single person was killed. Yes, there were battles that were fought. Yes, there were people that died, but mostly, it seems, had to do with the king and the army rather than all of the people and complete, total destruction. What that does, if that's the case, what that does is that sets a baseline and says, okay, what we read in the Bible, and I can talk a little bit more about this maybe in the question and answer period, but what we read in the Bible is written in this context where people described battle victories this way. Joshua describes Israel's battles in the same way that other kings, other peoples in the ancient Near East did. And that's the way that they talked about battle victories back then. That helps a little bit in that, okay, well, we're not talking about genocide. We're talking about the ways that battles were fought and battles were described in that time. But that still leaves open the question, okay, what do we do with God? God who says, go and do these things. And this is where, again, I want to take us to, and I think for me, it's helpful to compare and contrast the way that God is described in the Bible with the way that other peoples in the ancient Near East described their gods and what they wanted them to do. So, one example. And this one, I want to go to the very first chapter in the Bible because beginnings are important. Beginnings set the tone for everything else that follows. And we know this. If you get a message, if you get an email, if I get an email and it says, Dear Gord Oeste, I know whoever it is doesn't know me all that well, and it's probably a fairly formal email as opposed to somebody that says, Hey, Gord, starts differently, right? And the tone is different, and we know that the content that's going to follow is going to be a little bit different in terms of its tone and focus. Well, if we go to the very first chapter in the Bible and set that in its context in the ancient Near East, the way that other people around that time described their gods and the way that creation happened, looks very different. So if we can go to the next slide, yeah. One of the ways that the Bible, and there's a number of these, where the biblical portrait of God is very different from gods in the ancient Near East. And in this one that I want to look at, God says, no war in my creation. So let me fast forward, take you to the ancient Near East. One of the creation stories in the ancient Near East is a Babylonian creation story called the Enuma Elish. And in the Enuma Elish, there's basically a civil war between the gods. And the gods appoint Marduk to be their champion, and they say to him, deal with this. And so Marduk does. Marduk prepares for war. Look at this is part of the way that Marduk is described as he gets ready for the battle that he's about to engage with. It says, the Lord Marduk raised deluge, his great weapon. He mounted his terrible chariot. He hitched it to his 4 horses. Notice the name of the horses, right? Slaughterer, merciless, overwhelmer, soaring. These are not the names of, My Little Ponies that he's taken into war with him, right? This is a fearsome battle arraignment. And when the battle is described, as you'll see on the next slide, Marduk engages in one-on-one battle combat against Tiamat, the leader of the opposing forces. And Marduk fights against her. At one point, he finally kind of breathes his ill wind into her and kind of blows up, distends her body. He shoots his arrow into her heart, and he slays her. And then right at the end, right, he does the victory pose. He stands on her, and you'd have to imagine him doing the arms flexing as he stands over her. You are vanquished. And then out of that, Marduk creates. He takes half of Tiamat's carcass. Out of one half, he creates the earth. The other half, he uses to create the heavens. Beginnings are important. They say something. They say something about who we are. They say something about what we value. What do you think the Babylonians valued? What do you think is core, central to their identity? War, battle. Now go to the first chapter in the book of Genesis. God creates. He says, let there be light. And there's light. Let there be heavens. Let there be dry ground. Let there be stars. Let there be sky and sea animals. Let there be land animals. And then, as Logan reminded us, God says, let us create in our image. No battle, no conflict here. God creates in this orderly way. Very different ethos from the ancient Near East. A very different picture of who God is. God says no war in my creation. That's where we're going to start. Another place where we see a big difference between the God of the Bible and the gods in the ancient Near East has to do with their approach to weapons of mass destruction. So, God says no weapons of mass destruction when my people fight. That's his priority, his emphasis. So, as humans, we've become, we're very creative. And unfortunately, we've become very creative in fashioning these weapons that are more efficient and ever more deadly. So, my daughter who teaches history in high school kind of taught me that if you drop the biggest ever developed nuclear weapon on my hometown in Cambridge, it would wipe out everything from all the way down to Windsor and all the way up to the Muskokas. All of that. In the ancient Near East, the weapon of mass destruction looked like this. Oops, not that. That's today. Looked more like that. In the ancient Near East, the weapon of mass destruction was the chariot. And that simple innovation of taking a warrior and putting him on a platform. And sometimes there would be, one-person driver, and he would drive and he would multitask. He would drive and he would shoot arrows and he would engage in combat. Sometimes, or quite often, there were 2 people on a chariot, a driver and somebody with a bow and arrow. Sometimes there were 3 people on a chariot, driver, bow and arrow person, and I'll call him a hacker slasher for when you get up close. They would take a sword or a mace or a club, and when you got close, they would smash you on the head with it. What made this so deadly was that instead of, for example, taking archers and they stood in a static position, you could fire from all kinds of different places. You were firing from a mobile platform that made you difficult to hit. You could flitz into the battle and then drive out, though the chariot itself became a weapon. And if you had them, you had overwhelming fire superiority. So every king in the ancient Near East wanted to get these chariots that were driven by horsepower. So for example, on the next slide, you'll see the Pharaoh Tutmosis boasts that he captured 2,041, approximately, horses. Yeah, he's pretty exact. 2,041 horses. Why are those important? They're important because they drive the chariots. Every king wanted to have as many chariots, as many horses as possible. The more, the better, the stronger, right? Now, switch over to the biblical context. In a proverbial preemptive strike in Deuteronomy chapter 17, when God sets out the way that his kings should, some of their priorities, the things that are most important for them, God sets out in Deuteronomy 17. He says, my kings should not go to Egypt, should not get more war horses. I don't want you to equip yourselves for battle that way. Not only that, but even in the actual war texts themselves, in the book of Joshua, when Joshua is fighting against the Canaanites and they capture some chariots, you know what God says to Joshua? God doesn't say, hey, great, now we've got a great weapon. And God says, no, not for my people. God tells Joshua to destroy the chariots, to use the horses only for domestic purposes. That's crazy in the ancient Near East. No God would ever say that to any of their kings, and yet here's the God of the Bible saying, this is not what I value. This is not the way that I want my people to engage. Let me give you one more in the time that we have left. No bloody hands temple. So let me explain that a little bit, because that sounds pretty gruesome. Again, let's go back to context. Let's go back to the ancient Near East. In the ancient Near East, the typical pattern followed a BBB pattern. A king would go into battle, and after a successful battle or a campaign, he would build a temple, and then he would boast about his victories, having them inscribed on the temple walls. And so, Ashish, if you want to just scroll through some of these fairly quickly, you'll get a picture of, these are some of the pictures on ancient Egyptian temples that you would be walking by. If you were going in to worship the Egyptian gods in their temples, you would be walking past these pictures, taking them all in, and this is part of the ethos where the king inscribes his victories for you to see, and all of this is in honor of his God. So imagine today, imagine walking into here. You know, and in the lobby, there's a bronze statue with, I don't know your pastor, so let's say Pastor Bob. And he's got a spear in his hand, fighting against the, enemies. And you had pictures on the walls here of all of the battle victories that your church has won in taking territory for God. That's kind of what it would be like for someone in an ancient Egyptian context, walking into their temple. Now, David. David is Israel's greatest warrior. He is celebrated in the Bible. He's the one that all of the kings, other kings are compared to. He's ready to engage in that BBB pattern, just like in the ancient Near East. He's battled and he's ready to build a temple for his God. And what does God say to him? In the book of Chronicles, we read this. David, next slide, thank you. David says to his son, I wanted to build a house for the name of the Lord. The name. The name is not just what God is known by, but the name encapsulates part of his character. It is synonymous with his identity. And so David says, I wanted to build a temple for my God. But on the next slide, God says to David, you will not build my temple. You will not build the house for my name. Why? You've got blood on your hands. You've fought too many battles. You will not be the one who builds this place that becomes synonymous with who I am and my identity, the things that I value. Instead, who gets to build the temple? Next slide. Solomon. Hebrew, Shlomo. Shlomo is a wordplay off of the word shalom, the word for peace. The man of peace will build my temple, the place that is synonymous with my identity. And not only that, but on the next slide, you'll see that God kind of says, the one after that, apologies. Thanks, Ashish. And by the way, change the decorations in my temple, right? What does God want adorning his temple? I'd like lilies. I'd like pomegranates. I'd like palm trees, Edenic pictures to decorate my temple. Again, very, very different from the gods of the ancient Near East, very, very different from the pattern that we find Israel situated in. And these pictures of God that undermine the typical pattern for war and battle in the ancient Near East, they help, for me, I haven't talked about the New Testament, but for me what they do is they help bridge the gap. So that who we see Yahweh to be in the Old Testament is not actually all that different from the God that we see in the New Testament when Jesus comes and lives and says, turn the other cheek, forgive your enemies. Again, it doesn't solve anything. This is such a massive area, the area when Pastor Sawyer said, we want to talk about divine violence. I thought, oh my goodness, this is a massive area. But in this one small slice, these are a few things that have been helpful for me as I've thought about divine violence in the Old Testament. Thank you for your time.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for welcoming me here. Thank you, Pastor Sawyer. Thank you, Pastor Lewis. I don't know about all of you, but I've found myself not only tremendously intellectually satisfied by these two outstanding presentations, but spiritually moved by them as well. Maybe it's a Jewish thing, but I think you stood up here and justified and added testimony to many ideas that I've heard over the years being desecrated by ignorance. I thank you so much for the clear-headed presentations that you've delighted us with this evening. And I'll try and add a little bit of a Jewish frame to this conversation. How we understand violence in the Bible through a Jewish lens. The Bible is, for the Jewish people, a complex tapestry of stories, laws, and teachings that grapple with the human condition, including the reality of violence. For Jewish interpreters, the Bible's narratives are not just historical accounts, but paradigmatic stories. They are archetypal tales that address life's deepest theological and ethical questions. And in addressing the topic of violence, there's one particular biblical story on which future debate and discussion focuses. It's one story in the book of Numbers, and all of the subsequent rabbinic commentary that focuses on that story. Jews believe that there are two Torahs, two laws, the written law and the oral law, or the written tradition and the oral tradition. And you don't study the written tradition without its complement, understanding that later commentary adds richness and depth and meaning to what may seem to be very simple at a surface level. What's a story? I'm actually happy that it hasn't been mentioned yet by either of my two co-presenters, because it means I can present something that adds to the conversation. It's a story of Phineas, in Hebrew Pinchas, the 25th chapter of the book of Numbers. So that's the story I want to focus on today in my remarks. I heard that people who come to this church know their Bible, that they're comfortable opening up the Bible. So I don't have slides, but I have a book that I think is better than slides called the Bible. And if you have it on your phone, or if you have it maybe at your seats, you can read along with me the 25th chapter of the book of Numbers, the story of Phineas. The story begins with the Israelites staying at Shittim. They are encamped in the wilderness. I'll begin with verse 1. The men began to indulge in sexual immorality with Moabite women, who invited them to the sacrifices to their gods. The people ate the sacrificial meal and bowed down before these gods. So Israel yoked themselves to the Baal of Peor, and the Lord's anger burned against them. Basically, folks, a giant house party that's gotten out of control. They invited the wrong girls to hang out at the party, these Moabite women, seducing all the men. The Bible does not like the Moabites. And not only was there sexual seduction, but we had a nice idolatrous barbecue to accompany it. The Lord said to Moses, "Take all the leaders of these people, kill them, and expose them in broad daylight before the Lord, so that the Lord's fierce anger may turn away from Israel." God's instructions to Moses: kill them all. So Moses said to Israel's judges, "Each of you must put to death those of your people who have yoked themselves to the Baal of Peor." Notice what happens here. God's instruction was not, go tell these other people to do this. It was, go kill them with the leaders of the people. Moses passes on the job because he doesn't want to take, assumingly, responsibility. At this point in the story, that's the last we hear about any punishment against these sinful men by either the leaders of the tribes or by Moses. The presumption in the rabbinic literature is they're too weak to do anything about it. Maybe scared of the outcome. Then an Israelite man brought into the camp a Midianite woman right before the eyes of Moses and the whole assembly of Israel while they were weeping at the entrance to the tent of meeting. It got worse. When Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, the priest, saw this, he left the assembly, took a spear in his hand, and followed the Israelite into the tent. He drove the spear into both of them, right through the Israelite man and into the woman's stomach. By the way, I remember learning this story in elementary school, and everybody said, "This is so cool." Then the plague against the Israelites was stopped, but those who died in the plague numbered 24,000. The Lord said to Moses, "Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, the priest, has turned my anger away from the Israelites." God is thrilled. Moses, you couldn't do it. Heads of the tribes couldn't do it, but Phinehas did it. He took actions into his own hands. Where am I? The 12th verse. "Therefore tell him, I am making my covenant of peace with him. He and his descendants will have a covenant of a lasting priesthood, because he was zealous for the honor of his God and made atonement for the Israelites." At first glance, this story seems to endorse Pinchas's vigilantism unequivocally. His violent act saves lives, right? The plague stops, averts divine wrath, and earns divine approval. The Bible, in this instance, appears to sanction violence as a necessary response to egregious sin in a world where covenantal fidelity is under threat. Pinchas acts where others hesitate, and his zeal is framed as heroic, even redemptive. It suggests that the Bible does not view violence as inherently wrong. In a violent world where idolatry, immorality, and rebellion can destabilize a community, violence at times is seen as a tool to restore order and protect the sacred. That's the written Bible. The Jewish tradition's engagement with this story does not end there. Later Jewish texts go nuts. They're not happy. We have texts called Midrashim. Midrashim date from the 4th, 5th, 6th century. Early rabbinic works on the Bible. They're not happy. Later commentaries in the medieval period, through the Enlightenment, even up until today, reveal a deep ambivalence about what happened in this scene, reflecting a tradition that is weary of unchecked zeal and its consequences. These texts caution against the dangers of violence, even when it appears divinely sanctioned, and they impose significant limits on its use. I want to share with you some of these insights from later Jewish texts to understand the way they are critical of this story and the subsequent message that they are delivering to the reader on this theme, particularly of violence that we're sanctioned to take into our own hands. One concern is the personal toll of zealotry on the zealot. A 19th century commentator, Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, reflects on why God grants Pinchas a covenant of peace. He writes this, I quote, "In reward for calming the anger and wrath of the Blessed Holy One, God blessed him with the attribute of peace, that he should not be quick-tempered or angry. Since it is in the nature of Pinchas's action, killing human beings with his hands, to leave an intense emotional unrest in the soul afterwards, the blessing he received was to be in a state of peace and tranquility. Here, the tradition acknowledges that violence, even when it's justified, scars the soul. Pinchas's act, though heroic, risks leaving him emotionally volatile, and the divine gift of peace is a remedy for the inner turmoil that violence engenders. Another perspective focuses on the social dangers of zealotry. Also from the 19th century, Rabbi Shmuel Benjamin Sofer. He praises Pinchas for acting in God's honor, but notes that such combativeness is a double-edged sword. He suggests that God's blessing of peace is meant to temper Pinchas's zeal, helping him achieve balance to prevent unnecessary conflict. Tradition recognizes that zeal, while sometimes necessary, can spiral into destructive aggression if it's not carefully managed. Perhaps most strikingly, some Jewish interpreters question whether zealots like Pinchas are fit for leadership. A couple of chapters later in Numbers 27, right after Pinchas's act, Moses learns that he will not lead the Israelites into the promised land and asks God to appoint a successor. Let the Lord, God of all spirits, appoint someone over the community who shall go out before them and come in before them, and who shall take them out and lead them in. And who does God choose to succeed Moses? Joshua, described Numbers 27, verse 18, as a man filled with the Spirit. A Hasidic rabbi, Menachem Mendel of Kotz, connects this moment to Pinchas, suggesting that Pinchas was supposed to be Moses' successor. Moses had initially considered him to be his successor, but after witnessing this zealous act, Moses concluded a zealot cannot be the leader of Israel. Why? Because leadership requires patience and empathy and the ability to tolerate diverse perspectives, qualities a zealot driven by uncompromising passion may lack. This interpretation underscores a critical principle. Even if violence is sometimes necessary, those who wield it may not be suited to guide a community towards peace. The most dramatic critique of Pinchas' zeal comes in a midrashic story about his later encounter with, of all people, a man named Jephthah. Jephthah is a judge in Israel whose story appears in the 11th chapter of the book of Judges. Jephthah, preparing for battle, vows to offer as a burnt offering, I hope some of you know this story, quote, "whatever comes out of the door of my house," if God grants him victory. Tragically, who walks out of the house? His daughter. Greeting him upon his return, he fulfills his vow, sacrifices her. Talk about violence in the Bible. The sages say that Jephthah could have sought to annul the vow that he made through the high priest, who, in this particular story of the rabbinic imagination, was Pinchas, the high priest. But neither man, neither Jephthah nor Pinchas, acts to save the girl. The story paints a damning picture. This is what the Midrash says. Pinchas says, he needs me, I should go to him, I'm the high priest and the son of the high priest. Shall I go to an ignoramus? Didn't move from his place. while Jephthah said, I'm the chief of Israel's leaders, and I should go to Pinchas? The conclusion of the rabbinic story, between the two of them and their arrogance, the young woman perished. Both leaders, consumed by pride, fail to act, and an innocent life is lost. The story goes further, blaming Pinchas not only for this death, but also for failing to intervene in a later conflict where Jephthah kills 42,000 Ephraimites. That's in the 12th chapter of the book of Judges. The text declared who really is responsible for the killing of all these people. Say that Pinchas did it. He could have intervened on Jephthah's behalf, and he did not do so. He could have annulled Jephthah's vow, and did not do so. This story is a searing indictment of Pinchas's zeal. What began as zeal for God's honor in Numbers 25 has metastasized, to borrow a term from the tradition, into zeal for his own leadership, his own status. The text warns, I quote, "Woe for the kind of greatness that buries those who have it." Isn't that a beautiful line? Can I say it again? Woe for the kind of greatness that buries those who have it. Woe for the kind of greatness that does not bring good for the world. Pinchas's passion, once a force for salvation, becomes a source of destruction when it prioritizes ego over responsibility. This story illustrates another profound insight. Zealotry, even when initially righteous, risks becoming self-serving and catastrophic. So what do these interpretations tell us about the Jewish view of violence? First, the Bible acknowledges that violence has a place in a world marred by sin and conflict. Pinchas's act in the 25th chapter of Numbers saves lives in the end and restores divine favor, suggesting that in extreme cases, violence can serve justice and protect the community. Yet, our tradition does not leave this endorsement unchecked. Through commentary and midrash and later interpretation, interpreters impose stringent limits. They highlight its psychological and social costs, question the fitness of violent actors for leadership, and warn against the slippery slope from divine zeal to personal pride and arrogance. Later texts, like the story about Pinchas and Jephthah, go so far as to hold leaders accountable for failing to prevent violence in the first place, effectively raising the bar for when and how violence can be justified. The nuanced approach resonates with a broader Jewish ethic. The Talmud, for instance, prioritizes peace and reconciliation consistently over conflict, teaching, quote, "Great is peace, for all blessings are contained within it." Rabbinic law restricts vigilante actions. It requires judicial processes to maintain order and fairness. The Pinchas story is not meant to be an endorsement of vigilante violence. It speaks to us about a particular case where an act had to be done in a specific context. But what actually happens to the story in the end is it becomes a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked zeal. The Bible may not be what it seems to say, but what we deem it to mean. Jewish tradition walks this tightrope. It doesn't deny the reality of a violent world or the occasional need for violent responses, but it insists that such actions must be rare, carefully considered, and tempered by humility and accountability. My hope is that presenting this Jewish perspective can offer us a bridge to broader conversations. Many traditions grapple with sacred texts that depict violence, whether in defense of faith, justice, or survival. The Jewish approach invites us to hold two truths in tension. Violence may sometimes be necessary, but it is never to be glorified or pursued lightly. It demands introspection, restraint, and a commitment to peace as the ultimate goal. As we navigate our own violent world, the story of Pinchas challenges us to ask, when is action required to confront evil? How do we ensure that our zeal for justice doesn't blind us to the human cost? And how can we cultivate leaders who prioritize life and peace over pride and power? The Jewish reading of Pinchas teaches us that the Bible does not reject violence outright, but sees it as a tragic necessity in a broken world. Through centuries of interpretation, Jewish tradition refines this view, urging caution, accountability, and a relentless pursuit of peace. My hope is that we, in our diverse faiths and shared humanity, draw wisdom from these ancient texts to build a world where violence gives way to understanding and justice is tempered by compassion. Thank you, and I look forward to continuing the dialogue together.
We're now going to take a brief break, and we're going to have the QR code up on the screen, so please send in your questions, and we look forward to answering them together. We'll be back in 10. Oh, hello. We're going to get started in 2 minutes, so grab some food and grab a seat. We'll start soon. Hit a spin. We are live. We are good to go. So, some questions will still be coming in, but just based off of what's happened already. The first question, some of these might be directed at a particular panelist, but all of you are welcome to take a crack at it. So, if I'm understanding this question properly, it would probably be focused on what you were saying, Dr. Oeste, firstly, but you can all speak to this.
You can call me Gord.
Gord, my friend Gord. So, if I'm understanding this correctly, you talked about the use of hyperbole and how it's a literary device, and so how it's like saying the Maple Leafs got slaughtered, or they did the slaughtering, right? It's trying to convey an intended effect. Maybe the question is this: if this is what's being used, does that get in the way of understanding what God actually said or actually commanded, if there is a literary level in the way? Is that clear? Am I understanding the question right and asking it to you clearly as well? Or to even extend it perhaps, if we're using like the oral tradition afterwards as well, when we're using these tools to understand things better, is that taking us farther away from what God is actually saying and doing and commanding in these places? Very high level. You could all speak to it.
Yeah. Great question. Pass. No. Yeah. Does hyperbole take away from what God actually commanded? So many of these questions are big, and there's different tentacles to them. But one thing I suppose, just to begin with, is even the command, for example, in Deuteronomy 7, if you go to the charge, I think I had up on the screen Deuteronomy 7, verses 1 and 2, which was when you get into the land and you defeat them, then make sure that you kill everybody, show them no mercy, all of that kind of language. The very next two verses say, and by the way, don't marry their daughters. And so that second command wouldn't be necessary if the first one were intended completely literally, because there wouldn't be anybody left to marry, presumably. And so, in part, maybe even the command might include some components of hyperbole. But it gets at the question, okay, so what did God intend? What was God's purpose behind all of this? And I think part of it is actually the establishing God's people in God's land, in God's sacred land, in order that they would worship God and God alone. And so the problem with the Canaanites isn't their ethnicity, isn't their background. In fact, if you look carefully at the biblical text, the problem is sin, what they do. And the Israelites are actually threatened with the same kinds of things that the Canaanites are threatened with. And in fact, some of the same language of, I will completely destroy you, is used, for example, in prophet Jeremiah, in Jeremiah 25, when he talks about what God is going to do to Jerusalem. The problem is sin and idolatry. And so the hyperbole language is meant to say, in my reading of it, is meant to say, you need to deal with, that's not even the right word. We need to make sure to establish Yahweh's people in Yahweh's land, worshiping Him and Him alone, and there's a variety of different ways to do that. Hyperbole is one way of saying you need to defeat these. You need to put an end to this. Let's call it threat. And make sure that it's the command is emphatic, just as the intended result is emphatic. So, yeah.
Either of you want to jump on that?
What I'll say is, it's a great question, and it's precisely the reason why our Bibles look different than the Bibles you find in a church. Bibles in a church, for the most part, contain only the Scripture. In a synagogue, never. There's actually a law in Judaism that says it's forbidden to read from the Scripture without a commentary and a context. So when you come to a synagogue and you open up the Bibles that you'll find at the seats, there's commentary all over the place. We're not just nervous about hyperbole in sections that refer to events that happened thousands of years ago, but what about the hyperbole at events that seem to refer to the way we should act today to people who desecrate the Sabbath? I mean, without the commentary, I better walk around with stones in my pockets and start throwing them at people who I find doing things they shouldn't be doing on the Sabbath day. So all I'll add is, yes, the Bible is a very dangerous book to read without context and without commentary and without guidance. And unfortunately, throughout history, we've seen examples of manipulations of the text that have been used to do things that I don't believe were ever God's intention, because of games that people play with verses, that games that would not have happened if proper context, like both of your beautiful remarks, that's what they were to me. These were beautiful interpretations Your remarks, I'm going to invite you to our synagogue because that's what you both did. You said, don't read the Bible literally. Let's take this as a whole book and try and put the pieces together.
Good. Maybe a different question for Dr. Gates then. From, I'm not an apologist, you are, but I watch your people online. And so as I'm looking at videos of people on campuses giving public remarks and discussions and taking questions from the audience, if I have my finger on the pulse of anything at all, it's that perhaps there were more questions about the Trinity or inerrancy in decades long ago, but questions from contemporary audiences, so your kids or your grandkids, seem to lean more in this direction of justice. And you talked about using the standards of God from his actions to critique God's actions. When it's war or any other type of normative claim or behavior of God on our lives or on his own. Could you speak to perhaps what have you seen and why do you think that is? And does it point to something that perhaps would be valuable for all of us to know today as well?
Yes, yeah. I mean, for me, what illustrates this vividly is my experience as an undergraduate, 2009-ish, up to today. And when I was an undergrad, moral relativism was the thing. So in our classes, this idea that there is absolute right and wrong, got so much pushback on that. I felt I was the only one in the room who saw it differently. Whereas today, all of my students believe in moral absolutes. Almost all of them. And why? Well, because they realize that if they're going to care about social justice, if they're going to care about Black Lives Matter, then they have to say, this isn't just true for me, true for you. There's a standard of truth, a standard of justice that applies to everyone, even if you feel differently about it. And so I think actually I'm finding this has set up students to be open to this idea of where does that value come from? It's not something we can prove in a test tube. It's not something that can be based just on mere observation. And I think there's also a realization with that is that these values come from somewhere. And many of the values we cherish so deeply, like human rights, this was the focus of my doctoral work, was showing that the idea of human rights actually has a very distinct history. It really emerged out of this Judeo-Christian tradition based on this notion of equality. We really don't find that in other worldviews out there. Other worldviews have great things to offer, but this idea of every single person has an equal dignity and value and should be treated in this certain way, that's not something you can prove without bringing something metaphysical in the picture, and it's something that distinctly correlates and is a product of this Judeo-Christian vision of God and how he's made us. So I think there is a great opening here, a great bridge for those of us who are Christians and we're wanting to invite people to consider the Christian faith, is to find something in people's worldview that is worth affirming. Yes, human rights, I agree. Can we have common ground there? What a wonderful thing for you to stand for out in the world today. I think what inclines me to the Christian faith is I feel I have here an explanation of where these come from and why they matter, and how they make sense as part of a larger story. So I think there are books like Dominion by Tom Holland, which came out a few years ago. A guy, I think he's on a journey towards faith, but was just writing the story, seeing how much Christianity has made the modern world. I think a lot of people are reading books like that, and it's leading them on a journey that I think is bringing many closer to faith, and I think that's encouraging.
Mm-hmm. Either of you want to speak to that as well? All right, then. No, it's fine.
I'm not sure if I want. I'm thinking of something, but I don't know if I want to say that. All right, I will.
All right, good.
Look, Jews are sort of finding themselves today in the middle of all this university stuff. Am I wrong? It's very hard to have this discussion, and I'm thinking this over before I wrote down my remarks over and over it again, that I'm speaking on behalf of a people whose only country right now, is currently at a war, and they're being accused of committing genocide. And I got to speak about violence in the Bible. In a church, knowing that anti-Semitic tropes in the past have identified the God of the Old Testament being the angry, vengeful, mean God, and that's why the Jews are doing what they're doing in Gaza. So I don't want to get into the politics of what's going on there, but I do want to say that the beauty of tonight's program for me is I just want to say thank you to the two for. Why am I so spiritually moved by these two presentations that came before me? Because you heard two people who are not from my tradition who are saying this anti-Semitic trope that you might hear out there, that the God of the Old Testament is the angry, vengeful God. That's the God of Israel. Then and now, you both stood up here and said, it's not true. That's the same God that we have in the New Testament. And that God in the Bible is a God of justice and of love. And that they are not opposites. Those are not opposites of each other. And that God can be justified sometimes in either circumstance. So I'll just end it by saying thank you so much. You don't know what those talks did for me personally. And we need more of it. You both, like I said in my speech, helped walk that tightrope, which I think is true to the biblical message. That God is complex and holds these values in tension. And there are times when you'll see love manifesting strongly, and sometimes justice, and that's life. And that's the messiness of the real world. And I wish that university conversations today would look more like the conversation we had tonight, and not the black and white that Dr. Logan is saying he hears commonly in the circles in which he travels.
Thanks for sharing that. And thank you for coming, because I know that's also, you're taking a step of courage as well, coming to join us tonight, so we're glad you're here. So perhaps I'll ask something. Oh, you can clap for me too, or was that for him? Very practical, pragmatic question. You're talking with a student or a congregant, or someone on the street, and they make the offhand remark, well, the God of the Old Testament is a moral monster. Okay, they follow Dawkins on Twitter. It's that offhand. This happens at a Thanksgiving dinner, or you're talking with a colleague, or you mentioned to the cashier at Tim's that you're on your way to church. Is there a recommended response, like in a haiku format, or is it? Do you say to them, well, what do you mean by that? Do you follow with the Socratic, putting the burden on them? You could like literally say these are the words, or you could say, you know what, this is what I found is helpful in the past. But for people here who encounter this claim and don't have half an hour and a PhD, what would you advise they do? No rush.
How do you distill mounds of discussion into an elevator conversation? Yeah, not very easy at all. I suppose for me, I would, I teach my students all the time that God, as you were saying, the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament, there's so much continuity there. And so I guess for me, first of all, the first response would be, well, tell me more about why you would say that, and ask people to explain a little bit more about their thinking. And then if I had a chance, I think I would talk about, and I say this somewhat tongue-in-cheek with my students, but the God of the Old Testament is actually merciful and gracious. And so the passage that you took us to in Exodus 34 is a great picture of this lopsided God who is gracious and loving and faithful, and I'm going to forget all of the 6 different traits, but there's 6 traits that are positive, and then, or not positive, but there's 6 traits that show God's grace and mercy, and then there's, on the other hand, there's this, but he punishes to the 3rd and 4th generation. And for me, my God is lopsidedly tilted towards grace and mercy and kindness and chesed and compassion. And so for me, in a few minute conversation, I'd want to say, my God is this God who leans so heavily towards justice, or towards mercy and kindness, recognizing the importance of justice, but leans towards mercy whenever possible, and kind of point to a couple of examples. And there's tons of them in the Old Testament.
Yeah. I think a short answer that could be given that people are familiar with is to think about Jonah. I think it's great to be able to acknowledge, a lot of people do say that, don't they, about the God of the Old Testament. But have you thought about, the story of Jonah? And most people have heard of, this fishy story about Jonah, right? They know about, the fish and he was swallowed, and maybe they've seen the Veggie Tales or something like that.
Amen, brother.
But what's amazing about that story, just reading it more as an adult, post-Veggie Tales, is, we get the sense when we hear it for the first time that the reason why Jonah wants to flee to Tarshish is because he doesn't want to go to those Ninevites. They're violent people. He's sort of afraid for his own skin. But when at the end of the story, when Jonah does go and preaches to them and they repent, what he says in response to that is he's angry at God. And he's angry at God because he says, is this not why what I said when I was yet in my country? That's why I made haste to flee to Tarshish, for I knew that you are a gracious God, merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love, relenting from disaster. And I think,
those are all the words I forgot.
well, I just love this idea that what Jonah is so upset about is not that God would ever destroy Nineveh, but that God would have mercy on it. And Jonah's saying that he knew God would be like this because he has been that way since the beginning. You always are like this, God. And I think I just find that as a nice place to land on. Jonah, I think, dating-wise, is one of the earlier books in terms of when we know it's final, when we have the copy, when it was written. So here you have one of these earliest parts of the Old Testament. And the message of this book is not, oh, God is so violent. It's, I can't believe how loving God is. And I guess I just feel, because people know the story, that can be a neat way, if it's a Thanksgiving meal, to sort of give something to get people thinking about. And of course, if this really is an issue for them, there are wonderful books that, I think you have one of them, on this topic, that I think if someone wants to go into, this is a real issue for them, I'd say that's where, hand them a resource, get them going to the experts, because these are complicated texts. We need this, we need this commentary. We're 2,000 plus years removed from these texts, so it's not surprising that we're going to find things that are hard to understand.
The question to me is phrased a little bit differently. People don't ask me about the God of the Old Testament, but they just say, your God seems pretty violent. My standard short answer: beginnings, as Dr. Oeste said, the beginnings of the Bible point to the future. They lay the foundation. They explain who God is. They dictate how the rest of the Bible, the foundation upon which the rest of the Bible rests. There's only one time in the Bible where God says, I'm going to destroy the world. Only once. And it's my bar mitzvah portion, the story of Noah and the flood. And the story begins, the Lord saw that the earth was filled with violence. In other words, the most destructive thing that God ever did was only a response to the fact that we were destroying the world instead of him. We were ruining humanity. We were violent before he was violent. That's how God introduces himself to us in the Bible. Yeah, I can get angry at times, but I put the responsibility on you. God doesn't destroy the world because we don't pray to him enough. God doesn't destroy the world because we don't go to church enough. God doesn't destroy the world because we're not fervent enough in any of our religious doctrines or in our faith. It's only when we turn to violence that God himself responds in violence. And I hope that a message like that is not me defending God, but me introducing that God that I believe in, who walks between justice and mercy. And then maybe the person might say, oh, that makes sense.
Interesting. Okay. If you remember a couple months ago, Rabbi, Pastor Dave, myself, and you, we were getting coffee talking about this event, and it was like 2 days before I was speaking about the Passover here at Bayview, and I said, hey, what's something you wish Christians could understand about this story? And you told me wonderful things, and we were blessed for it. So I guess when you come and hear Christians talking about this, and when we were even talking about this topic, then you were saying how from a Jewish perspective, you're obviously not looking to the cross as an explanation, as part of your explanatory power. So for a Christian who is talking with their Jewish neighbor or colleague or coworker about this, what are things perhaps on this topic that you wish just Christians knew? Like, here are just some differences that's just helpful in a conversation.
80 years ago, 1/3 of the Jewish people were wiped off the face of the earth. And there was a man who used to sit, a very old man who used to sit with me, and he was the one who sat in the hall of study, which is in the bottom of the rabbinical school, in the hall of study. And he was called a sho'el u'meshiv. When you had questions, you go to him. He hangs around. And if you had a question about something you were learning, you'd call him over. I didn't know who he was. He was a sort of creepy old man who sat around learning all day, reading all day. And one day I was sitting around the table and we were debating a troubling passage in the Bible about the Amalekites. Jews read this passage about what the Amalekites did to you on your way forth from Egypt. We read it at least 3 times a year, including before Purim. Purim is the story of the book of Esther. Remember when Haman tried to wipe out all the Jews? We read this passage before because the Bible says Haman is the Agagite. And who is the king of the Amalekites? Agag, if you know the story. So before Purim, we remind ourselves. Agag was spared, if you know the story. We should have listened when the Bible said, remember what the Amalekites did to you. Wipe them out. Every last one of them. They are pure evil. Do not forget. We, at my study table, were discussing how troubled we were by this passage. The same thing that we're talking about tonight. How could you be so heartless? How could God command such a thing? That even the children, even the animals of the Amalekites should be destroyed. What kind of God is this? And the old man, the sho'el u'meshiv, his name was Rabbi Shapiro, a blessed memory. He came forward and said, nothing troubles me about this passage. And he slowly told us his story, how his whole family was murdered, how he survived the Holocaust all alone, what they did to his sister, what they did to his home, what they did to his town, what they did when he came back to his town after the Holocaust and tried to just get the few belongings that were left to him. He said, you're lucky to live in the world you live in, but I lived through the worst horrors that the world has ever seen, and I'm telling you, evil exists. Evil is real. And when someone is out there and trying to kill you, and there is nothing that you can say or do to change their mind, the only option at your hand is to wipe them off the face of the earth first. And the Bible recognizes that that is true. We can debate who's an Amalekite today. Is there such thing as an Amalekite today? But you don't debate a Holocaust survivor. When he tells you, I saw with my own eyes what Amalekites did to my sister, you don't argue. I've never been troubled with that. From that day forward, I've never debated anybody or been troubled by that verse ever again. What Dr. Logan said, our moral view of the world around us is shaped by our experiences and by our culture. So be careful, everyone. We live in a nice, beautiful, peaceful, calm country. Thank God we don't have rockets being shot at us or Nazis coming to get our families and send them to ghettos. And we should be careful, and Jews try and be careful, about applying the moral circumstances of our reality, what we know, to scenes from the Bible which are unfamiliar to us. So my answer, it's a long answer to your question, but I feel like I had to give a deeply felt response to what some of the modern charges are against the Bible and from where they are based. And when you're living in an era today where we still have people alive, not for much longer, but you're still having people alive who saw evil, and it's not just Holocaust survivors, but World War II veterans, and people like me who lived through 9/11 and saw what that was like. When we see evil right in our faces, some of these verses that are so troubling in Canada don't seem all as troubling after all when we remove ourselves from our context and think about some of the terrible things that the world has lived through in the past century.
Thank you. Anything to add on? So originally we promised we'd be done around 9 p.m. It's 9:20, so not terrible, but just want to honor your time and also leave some space for discussions with each other and our panelists as well. So if we're good with that, I'd like for us to thank our three panelists for coming and spending their time this evening with us. All right, so please feel free to hang around, enjoy each other's company, come speak with them, and thank you for coming tonight in person, and to our friends online. Have a great night. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Very powerful.